Watch what happens when Congressman Salud Carbajal completely corners Pete Hegseth, tearing down political theater to expose a massive security failure in real time. United States Marines are fundamentally trained for war, not for the mechanics of crowd control within the borders of an American city. Yet, there they were, deployed straight into Los Angeles, armed, highly visible, and positioned in direct defiance of the stated will of both a sitting governor and a local mayor. That scenario is not some ambiguous gray area. It is a glaring contradiction sitting in plain sight. And when Congressman Salud Carbajal made the deliberate decision to press that very contradiction during a congressional hearing, what followed was not a moment of clarification. It was a complete and utter collapse. This was not your standard, normal committee hearing. This is exactly what happens when a clean, undeniable conflict collides head-on with a witness who simply cannot afford to resolve that conflict out loud. From the very first exchange, Carbajal does not wander off topic, he does not generalize his statements, and he fiercely refuses to give any breathing room for loose interpretation. He locks in the frame immediately. Marines are warfighters. They are not instruments deployed for domestic political optics. Deploying them into Los Angeles under these volatile conditions demands a straightforward answer. Sitting directly across from him is Pete Hegseth, and the contrast between the two men is immediate. One side is constantly narrowing the scope of the question, while the other side is desperately trying to expand the response. One side is demanding absolute clarity, while the other is reaching for rhetorical distance. Carbajal calls the situation exactly what it is: political theater. He does not use that phrase as a cheap slogan, but rather as a precise diagnosis. Because when armed military forces are inserted into a civilian domestic environment without the explicit consent of local authorities, the underlying question is no longer just a matter of operational logistics. It instantly becomes constitutional, it becomes ethical, and most importantly, it becomes accountable. Knowing this, Carbajal asks the exact kind of question that leaves absolutely no room to hide behind carefully crafted language. He asks, are the Marines in Los Angeles ordered to protect property by any means necessary? It is a direct, piercing question built on a strictly closed structure, requiring a simple yes or a no. But what follows is not an answer at all. It is a calculated pivot. Hegseth immediately shifts to his talking points, mentions attacks on ICE officers, references broader threats, and tries to widen the frame. But the question does not move an inch. Carbajal ruthlessly cuts the noise back down, demanding just a yes or a no. And then comes the defining line that permanently changes the temperature of the entire room. This isn't Fox anymore. That statement is not meant as an insult. It is a profound procedural reset. It violently strips away the comfortable shield of narrative and replaces it with the heavy burden of obligation. Here is exactly where the deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. When a government official cannot bring themselves to answer a yes or no question, the underlying issue is rarely complexity. It is consequence, because a yes creates liability, a no creates a glaring contradiction, and anything floating in between those two words simply creates time. Hegseth desperately chooses time. Carbajal does not let him keep it. Carbajal narrows the focus once again, shifting from the broader mission to the strict rules of engagement, moving from intention directly to authority. Under the standing rules for the use of force, known as SRUF, are these Marines allowed to fire warning shots? Once again, it is a closed question. Once again, it is a strict binary. And once again, what follows is silence, a silence stretching far longer than it ever should. And then finally, buckling under a pressure that has been tightened deliberately, strategically, and publicly, Hegseth answers, no. That single, solitary word lands heavier than absolutely everything that was said before it. It lands heavy not just because of what the word confirms, but because of the agonizing amount of time it took to extract it. Because when one clear answer requires that much immense resistance, it forces a much larger question into the open. What exactly is being protected in every other response that never manages to reach clarity? This is no longer about one specific rule, one city, or one deployment. This is about a deeply ingrained pattern, and Carbajal sees it. He does not casually move on, and he does not soften. He continues to ruthlessly apply pressure, not by raising his voice, but by systematically removing every single possible escape route. Each subsequent question becomes smaller, tighter, and infinitely more precise, until the only remaining variable left is the willingness to answer honestly. And that is precisely where the hearing structurally shifts from a policy discussion into a high-stakes credibility test. Because what is being examined here is not just what Pete Hegseth says, it is everything he actively avoids saying. It is the vast gap between the structure of the question and the structure of the response. It is the measurable distance between accountability and performance. And as that gap steadily widens, something else entirely becomes visible. It is not found in the words themselves, but in the frantic effort to avoid them. The hesitation, the endless deflection, and the repeated refusal to engage with the simplest possible format, yes or no. That behavior is not confusion, that is cold calculation. So the massive contradiction we started with does not resolve, it deepens. Marines in a U.S. city, clear questions in a formal hearing, and answers that absolutely refuse to stay within the lines they were given. At this critical juncture, the hearing is no longer asking what happened, it is revealing exactly how power behaves when it is pressed in public. And once that pattern is established, the hearing stops being about a single deployment and transforms into a grueling test of limits. How far can a witness stretch language before it completely breaks? How long can accountability be delayed before it turns into undeniable exposure? Because what Salud Carbajal is doing here is not improvisation, it is method. He is not asking bigger questions, he is asking smaller ones, sharper ones, questions that surgically remove interpretation and forcefully demand ownership. And every single time Pete Hegseth expands, instead of answers, he inadvertently confirms the very thing he is trying so desperately to avoid. The Marines are not the center anymore. They are simply the entry point. What Carbajal is truly interrogating is the core of decision-making. Who authorized what, under what legal justification, and with what level of understanding regarding consequence. Because deploying military force into a domestic environment is never just a logistical move. It is a loud signal, and signals always carry intent, whether they are acknowledged or not. So when Hegseth actively refuses to anchor his answers, he is not neutral. He is leaving that intent undefined on purpose. And that is exactly where the logic tightens. If the mission is truly clear, the answer should be effortlessly clear. If the authority is legitimate, the explanation should be simple, but what we are watching is neither. We are watching a deliberate sequence where each answer attempts to completely reframe the question instead of actually resolving it, where each response introduces entirely new elements that were never asked for threats, agents, contacts, bringing up absolutely anything to avoid the narrow lane Carbajal keeps forcing him back into. This is exactly what evasion looks like when it is structured. It is not silence, but constant substitution. It's not outright refusal, but endless redirection. And the more it happens, the more glaringly visible it becomes. The contrast sharpens. Direct question, indirect answer, repeated again and again until the pattern is undeniable. Carbajal escalates, but procedurally, not emotionally. He begins to surgically strip away even the defensive language Hegseth is hiding behind. No speeches. In effect, no framing. Just yes or no. And when he says, this isn't Fox anymore, he is not just criticizing tone, he is completely eliminating the possibility of performance. Because a performance relies on narrative, and narrative requires time, and time is exactly what Carbajal is fiercely refusing to give. Now the hearing becomes something else entirely, a psychological compression chamber. Every single answer must fit into a smaller and smaller space, and anything that doesn't fit instantly becomes evidence of avoidance, and Hegseth feels it. You can visibly see it in the way his answers lengthen as the questions shorten. You can hear it in the desperate repetition of safe phrases, authorized, agents, security, words that sound complete but do not actually complete the question. And here is the most critical point. This is not just a communication failure. This is a catastrophic credibility failure. Because in a setting like this, clarity is not optional. It is the absolute minimum requirement. When clarity disappears, it does not create neutrality, it breeds deep suspicion. And when suspicion builds in a matter involving military authority inside a U.S. city, the stakes are no longer theoretical. Think deeply about the structure Carbajal is building. He starts with deployment, he moves to authority, and he locks in rules of engagement. Each step is not random. It is highly sequential, designed to permanently close every exit before moving to the next level. So by the time Hegseth gives that one-word answer, no, it is not a victory. It is a concession forcefully extracted under immense pressure. And concessions matter deeply, because once one answer is forced into clarity, every previous answer that successfully avoided clarity instantly becomes infinitely more suspect. That is exactly how evidence stacks, not necessarily by adding new information, but by aggressively reinterpreting what has already been said through the unforgiving lens of what was finally admitted. Carbajal understands that perfectly. That is why he does not celebrate the answer, he weaponizes it. He lets it sit, lets it reshape the room, and lets it fundamentally redefine the credibility of everything that came before it. And then he continues. Because the real question is no longer about what Marines are allowed to do. The real question is why it was so painfully difficult to say it, why a basic rule of engagement had to be extracted with a crowbar instead of clearly stated, why accountability had to be forced onto a leader instead of freely offered. And as that deeply unsettling question lingers, the hearing begins its massive pivot, not abruptly, but with terrifying inevitability. It shifts from deployment to responsibility, from responsibility to conduct, and from conduct to something far more dangerous. Because once you successfully establish that a witness will actively avoid clarity under pressure, the next logical step is to ask what else they have avoided when the stakes were even higher and the audience wasn't watching. And that is exactly where Salud Carbajal takes it next. Not louder, not broader, but much deeper. Because once a witness demonstrates a clear pattern of avoiding direct answers under pressure, the next question is no longer about policy, it is entirely about judgment. Not what decisions were proudly made in public, but what decisions were quietly made in private, in rooms without cameras, in conversations that were never meant to be scrutinized. And that is exactly when the hearing crosses a definitive line from uncomfortable into dangerous. The massive shift happens with one specific topic: communication. Not speeches, not hearings, but how sensitive information actually moves between people who hold power. Carbajal formally introduces the Signal group chat. They are simple words, but they carry explosive implications. A private channel, multiple participants, a journalist, family members, and according to the damning allegations, sensitive information placed directly inside that space. Now pause there, because this is no longer about interpretation. This is strictly about containment. Classified information is not just data, it is carefully controlled risk. It legally exists inside systems explicitly designed to limit exposure, to rigorously track access, and to completely prevent exactly the kind of uncontrolled distribution that a group chat represents. So when Carbajal brings that scenario into the hearing, he is not asking a theoretical ethics question. He is formally introducing a potential national security breach. And once again, he does not overcomplicate it. He narrows it completely down to responsibility. Will you take responsibility for making a mistake? It is a staggeringly direct question. No legal jargon, no escape through complexity, just pure ownership. Pete Hegseth doesn't take it. He doesn't even approach it. Instead, he blindly reaches for the exact same structure we have already seen fail: broad language. A generalized defense. Every way I communicate is authorized, but listen very carefully to what that specific answer actually does. It completely shifts the moral ground from was it appropriate to, was it allowed, and those are absolutely not the same question. Authorization is not absolution. Something can be technically permitted by a loophole and still be operationally reckless. Something can pass through the cracks and still blatantly violate the spirit of the rules designed to protect American lives. And that is the massive contradiction Carbajal is building right now, not just between question and answer, but between technical legality and true responsibility. So he escalates, not by adding noise, but by raising the stakes. He states it plainly. Many would say you broke the law. He doesn't hedge it, and he doesn't soften it. He puts the heavy accusation directly on the record, out in the open, where it cannot be ignored or reframed as a simple misunderstanding. And then he connects it to its ultimate consequence: service members' lives, extreme exposure, and risk. This is the true moral pivot of the hearing, because until this specific moment, everything could theoretically still be framed as a political disagreement, policy versus policy, interpretation versus interpretation. But once the conversation shifts to the potential mishandling of classified information, the cost is no longer abstract. It becomes human. Picture the reality clearly. Critical information about operations, troop movements, and tactical capabilities carelessly placed into a digital channel where control is entirely diluted. A space where participants extend far beyond the established chain of command. A space where one single weak point can instantly become a catastrophic breach point. That is not a minor technical violation. That is a massive vulnerability. And massive vulnerabilities in this context do not stay theoretical for long. They get violently exploited. Carbajal makes that terrifying connection explicitly clear. He does not just question the reckless action. He fundamentally questions the core fitness of the person who took it. You are unfit to lead. That statement is not dramatic rhetoric. It is a hard conclusion drawn directly from a solid chain of logic he has been meticulously constructing step by agonizing step since his very first question about Marines in Los Angeles. And notice closely what happens next. There is absolutely no substantive counterargument that directly engages with that devastating logic. There is no detailed breakdown of security protocols followed. There is no clear, ringing denial structured around hard facts. There is only the hollow repetition of the exact same defensive posture. Authorized, appropriate, controlled. Words that sound solid from a distance but completely collapse under inspection because they never actually meet the gravity of the accusation head on. This is exactly where the hearing permanently stops being a back and forth and transforms into intense one-directional pressure. Because once a witness outright refuses to engage with the core of a serious accusation, every additional response only reinforces the perception that there is something massive hiding there that they cannot safely confront. And Carbajal does not let the moment pass. He violently pushes through it, not simply to win the exchange, but to permanently document it, to make sure that the glaring absence of accountability is not just felt in the room, but officially recorded, visible, and undeniable. Because at this advanced stage, the question is no longer whether a grave mistake was made. The question is whether the person in charge is even capable of recognizing one. And when that answer clearly doesn't come, when fundamental responsibility is deflected instead of honorably accepted, the grim consequences expand exponentially. They expand from one encrypted chat to one bad decision to an entire pattern of leadership that constantly prioritizes self-protection over the hard truth. And that is the exact moment the hearing reaches its absolute breaking point. And when it breaks, it doesn't fracture quietly. It violently spills into absolutely everything that follows. Because once Salud Carbajal establishes that true responsibility will never be taken on something as deadly serious as handling sensitive intelligence, the next logical questions are no longer optional. They become completely unavoidable. Foreign policy, vital alliances, commitments that extend vastly beyond one American city, one deployment, or one single decision. Now, the ultimate test is no longer internal conduct. It is global consequence. So he aggressively pivots, but the ruthless structure remains the same. A simple question, a tightly closed frame. Yes or no? Should the United States continue supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia? This is not a complicated trick question. It is a fundamental baseline position that strictly defines global alignment, strategy, and credibility on the world stage. And once again, incredibly, Pete Hegseth does not answer it. He desperately reaches for a familiar shield. The president is committed to peace. But that is absolutely not what was asked. That is not even tangentially adjacent to what was asked. That is a coward's reframing designed to soften a position that absolutely requires ironclad clarity. Carbajal cuts it off immediately. Yes or no? Not interpretation, not intention, but a stated position. What follows is a terrifying hesitation that absolutely should not exist at this elite level of authority. Because when a superpower nation has already invested billions, when policy has already been firmly enacted, and when countless lives are tied to that decision, uncertainty is not a neutral stance. It is massively destabilizing, and only after sustained, agonizing pressure, after a brutal repetition that systematically strips away every possible exit, does the answer finally arrive. Yes. But it is not a clean yes. It is not an immediate yes. It is not a credible yes. And that critical distinction matters because leadership is never just about the final answer you give. It is entirely about how quickly you are willing to stand behind it. Delay inherently signals doubt. Deflection signals cold calculation. And both of those things signal extreme risk. Carbajal does not pause. He relentlessly moves forward, tightening the suffocating scope once again. He pushes straight into the heart of NATO, into Article 5, the absolute core of collective defense. If Russia invades a NATO ally, will you recommend that the United States fulfill its binding obligation? Again, this is foundational. This is not policy nuance. This is the very backbone of an alliance system that has defined global stability for decades. And yet, unbelievably, the answer does not come. Not directly, not immediately. Instead, there is a pathetic retreat into hypotheticals. Russia has not invaded a cowardly statement that actively avoids the scenario instead of bravely addressing it. Carbajal instantly shuts that deflection down, reclaims the time, and forcefully shoves the tight frame back into place. Yes or no. And finally, under the exact same suffocating pressure that has defined every single stage of this exchange, the answer is painfully extracted. Yes, again, not freely offered, forcibly extracted. And again, that stark difference means everything. Because by now, the terrifying pattern is fully complete. On domestic deployment, deep hesitation. On rules of engagement, immense resistance. On classified intelligence, total deflection. On defending Ukraine, dangerous delay. On upholding NATO, desperate evasion followed by a forced concession. Stack all those moments together, back to back, and what you get is not a series of isolated missteps. You get a complete, horrifying profile. And then comes the final question that ties all of it together. Not about policy, not about operations, but purely about loyalty. Is absolute political allegiance to Donald Trump a strict requirement for serving this nation, either in uniform or in the Department of Defense? This is the hidden axis that absolutely everything else has been silently rotating around. It was not spoken aloud until now, but it was heavily present in the shadow of every single avoided answer. Pete Hegseth tries to dismiss it, casually calling it a silly question. But make no mistake, that dismissal is the answer. Because a simple, resounding no would have ended the controversy instantly. A clear, definitive rejection would have immediately restored his alignment with the Constitution, with the sacred oath, and with the foundational principle that military service is strictly to the country, not to any one person. But that crucial moment of clarity never comes. And at that exact point, Salud Carbajal completely stops treating this charade as a dialogue. He renders a final, devastating judgment. You're an embarrassment to the United States. You're unfit to lead. He does not say this as political theater. He says it as a grim conclusion drawn directly from the wreckage of every unanswered question, every painfully delayed response, and every sickening moment where true accountability was cheaply replaced with performance. This is the ultimate moral line of the hearing. Because behind every one of these frustrating exchanges are very real, very deadly consequences. Service members placed into volatile environments, global alliances that depend entirely on certainty, massive intelligence systems that rely on unbreakable trust. When clarity disappears at the very top, fatal risk multiplies exponentially at every single level below it. That is not partisan politics. That is structural reality. So what did we actually witness here? We did not just witness a tough exchange or a heated moment. We witnessed exactly what happens when unchecked power is forcefully dragged into a space where it cannot control the terms and completely fails to meet the basic standard required of it. We witnessed the massive, terrifying gap between executive authority and personal accountability laid out bare in real time. And the dark question that remains hanging over us is no longer about one man or one explosive hearing. It is about the deeply broken system that allows this pattern to exist in the first place. If the truth only comes out when it is forced out, what happens when no one is there to force it? If absolute responsibility is always endlessly deferred, who ultimately bears the horrific cost? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the razor-thin line between democratic oversight and catastrophic systemic failure. If you want more deep breakdowns like this, where the difficult questions actually matter, where the answers are brutally tested, and where true accountability is never optional, make sure to hit the like button. Drop your perspective on this hearing in the comments below, share this video with someone who desperately needs to see it, and subscribe to the channel for the next deep dive.